Hello, class. Welcome to a Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know Ben Franklin was dedicated to keeping the colonies out of war until he was humiliated in Parliament in 1774? That the Patriots from Boston were actually able to get a lot of support from other colonies following the shutting down of the Boston port and the adoption of the Coercive Acts. And that, more than anyone else, a 31-year-old Thomas Jefferson responded to these coercive or intolerable acts with stinging criticism of King George and Parliament, setting the stage for him to be chosen 2 years later to head up the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will learn that and more. In episode 48, Ben Franklin gets roasted by Parliament, and the colonists get angry. Hello and welcome to class. To catch everyone up, I want to briefly provide context for our lesson today. So, last week, Bill and I went into detail about the passage, adoption of the Intolerable and the Coercive Acts and how the colonists responded to them. So just as a reminder, these were passed at the end of March 1774. They included the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice Act, and the Quebec Act. Now, the colonists were furious about the passage of the Coercive Acts and the Intolerable Acts, and Bill and I touched a little bit on how the colonists responded to it, and today I will get into more detail about the specific action that different colonies took in response to this. But before we get into that, I would like to take some time and talk about one Benjamin Franklin. So we're rewinding the timeline a little bit because the major event in Ben Franklin's life that we're going to focus on today happened in January of 1774. So this had happened right after the Boston Tea Party and just prior to the passage of the Intolerable Acts. Now, I know we're rewinding a little bit in our timeline, just a few months, but I thought it was worth it because I always found this story really fascinating and one worth diving into a bit deeper. But before we get to Benjamin Franklin's experience in Parliament, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about this great American. So Benjamin Franklin, by the 1770s, had been retired for a while and had an overarching desire to keep the colonies and England together. He believed that the British mostly, for the most part, desired to keep the colonies and England together, and that they had good intentions toward the colonies. He was once quoted as saying, "The popular inclination here is to wish us well, and that we may preserve our liberties." But Ben Franklin was always a bit torn. He loved London and loved England and lived there actually much of his adult life, but he was born in the colonies, and that's really where his heart was. At one point, Ben Franklin, in a letter written back to the colonies, was lamenting how he was genuinely torn between the two loves. Quote, "Being born and bred in one of the countries and having lived long and made many agreeable connections of friendship in the other, I wish all prosperity to both. But I have talked and written so much and so long on the subject that my acquaintances are weary of hearing and the public of reading any more of it, which begins to make me weary of talking and writing for them, especially as I do not find that I have gained any point in either country, except that of rendering myself suspected by my impartiality. In England, of being too much an American, and in America, of being too much an Englishman." Eventually, Benjamin Franklin will turn his impartiality, or I should say his partiality, specifically and wholly behind the Continental cause, attending the Second Continental Congress as a representative of Pennsylvania. While Ben Franklin eventually became a fervent revolutionary, it took him a while to get there. He had an incredible life, inventing the bifocals, the Franklin stove, the lightning rod, and numerous other things. Heck, we could do an entire podcast episode just on his inventions. We could also do an entire podcast episode just on his business endeavors. Having worked in his brother's print shop, he eventually opened his own in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin is what we would consider today a serial entrepreneur and could always be found doing something new. In 1754, at the outbreak of the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin called together representatives of various colonies at the Albany Congress and proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which was adopted by those in attendance but rejected by colonial legislatures. Benjamin Franklin genuinely believed that it was best for both England and the colonies to stay together, and for the colonies to unite in some type of effectual agreement with each other, which would then, in turn, strengthen the British imperial dynasty. Franklin lived most of his life in the colonies, but a lot of his later adult life in London. While he was there, he traveled all over Europe and found validation from his European contemporaries. He was in London in the late 50s and early 60s and returned to the colonies in 1762. He was then sent back to London in 1764 and stayed there until the experience in Parliament that we will talk about today. Ben Franklin said, quote, "Of all the enviable things England has, I envy most its people. Why should that petty island, which compared to America is but a stepping stone in a brook, why, I say, should that little island enjoy in every neighborhood more sensible, virtuous, and elegant minds than we can collect in ranging 100 leagues of our vast forest?" In 1765, when the Stamp Act was passed, Benjamin Franklin determined that, quote, "a firm loyalty to the crown is the wisest choice." He assumed that the best option for the colonies was to agree to the tax, for at this point he had underestimated just how much the colonists would be infuriated by the tax. And once he did realize this, he began to backtrack a bit and explain to those in London that maybe they should reconsider. He even went in front of the House of Commons, answering over 170 questions about why the Stamp Act should be repealed. He was then appointed by numerous colonies to be their representative in London and continued to fight against subsequent acts like the Townshend Act and the Tea Act in an attempt to advocate for the colonies in London. Throughout this fight, though, even though he was assumed of being partial to the colonies, which is understandable, he genuinely believed that the relationship between the mother country and her colonies could not only be salvaged, but be a happy and fruitful one. But then things began to go off the rails for Benjamin Franklin in London. As mentioned on a few podcast episodes back, I brought up that Thomas Hutchinson, at the height of the anger and frustration in Boston, had sent letters to George Grenville and specifically detailed how the best course of action was to limit colonial liberties in Boston to keep these colonists from rising up against the government. Franklin heard about these letters, and no one knows how he got a hold of them, but he did. And he knew that these letters were both damning and confidential, and he sent them back to the colonies. Now, this is important to understand. When Franklin did this, his intention was to turn the tide of anger away from the king and parliament and toward Governor Hutchinson. But it did not have the desired effect. The colonists did get angry at Hutchinson, but London came down hard on Franklin. Some historians believe that this was Franklin's desperate attempt for him to try to save the empire that he loved so much that he actually would call a, quote, precious china vase. Once the Adams cousins got a hand on the letters, they became public, and the Patriots used them to try to kick Hutchinson out of his job, which they did, and ship him back to England, which they did. This was, though, a huge scandal in London. There were actually two officials in London who really hated each other and believed the other had leaked the letters, and they dueled over it, all the while Benjamin Franklin kept his mouth shut. One man was injured, and they figured that when he was healthy enough, they would duel again. And it is probably at that point that Franklin knew, okay, I have to do something about this. Someone could literally die over this. Now, rumors have been swirling about who had written the letters, and Benjamin Franklin's name was included in them. His son, William Franklin, just could not believe the rumors that his father was potentially involved. I mean, he viewed this as one of the truly most dishonorable things his father could possibly do. William, at this point, was the governor of New England, a position that his father had politicked for and basically trained him for and had handed to him. Eventually, Benjamin Franklin did admit to sending the letters, and he tried to explain his intentions, but it didn't matter to really anyone, and all hell broke loose in London, and his son William was absolutely crushed and felt betrayed. At this point, everything Franklin had been working for the last 16 years when he was in and out of London began to unravel, and he was going to bear the brunt of the blame. In January 1774, Franklin arrived before the Privy Council to testify about the letters and Hutchinson's job security, and it was at this point that Franklin recognized this was an obvious opportunity for the Privy Council to bash Franklin and determine whether or not him releasing the letters was criminal. Once he recognized this, he asked for a few weeks to prepare for the questions with his attorney, which he was granted. But that request backfired, because in between the time of his first and second appearance at the Privy Council, word of the Boston Tea Party had reached London, and the frustrations and anger of the colonial actions were taken to a new level. And of course, who was the one blamed for the colonists taking it to this new level of felonious acts? Benjamin Franklin. When Franklin arrived back at the Privy Council, in the cockpit as it was known because apparently cockfights used to take place there, everyone was ready. There was a huge crowd and they were anxious to watch Ben Franklin get roasted by the council. This had to be truly one of the worst, if not the worst day in Benjamin Franklin's life. This amazing inventor, businessman, and philosophical leader in the colonies, truly the most famous American colonist, standing in front of the council in a room full of over 100 people, just getting lambasted for his dishonest and potentially criminal actions. King George's Solicitor General, Alexander Wedderburn, said, quote, "The doctor tells us that Mr. Hutchinson's letters had the effect of turning the mother country against her colonies. In truth, we have standing before us the real incendiary, the man behind those committees, who are inflaming the whole province against His Majesty's government. They have well learned the lessons taught in Dr. Franklin's School of Politics." Wedderburn continued by claiming that Franklin was, quote, "the planner, inventor, prime conductor of this whole contrivance against the Majesty's governor. This thief, this wily American. And that he was, quote, the actor and secret spring by which all the Assembly's motives were directed." The council, led by Wedderburn, verbally abused Franklin, calling him out for his dissension and criticizing him for his role in spreading of the revolutionary ideas. This verbal thrashing lasted about an hour, while he was stoic, standing alone in a room full of political and personal enemies. This attack was a personal insult to Franklin, And at this point, he felt totally alienated from England. Franklin was then fired as Postmaster General in the colonies, and he could not take it any longer. He traveled back to Pennsylvania in 1775, never to return to England, and for the rest of his life became committed to the colonial revolutionary cause. This was the straw that broke the camel's back for Franklin. He had decided that he was no longer interested in finding common ground with England and the colonies. As an aside, this is the beginning of the end of the relationship between Ben Franklin and his son William. William was beside himself that his father had leaked these letters and couldn't believe that he did it. Ben, the loyal, loving, and doting father that he was to William quite literally his entire life, figured that William would likely resign his position as governor of New England and support his father in this embarrassing chapter. But instead, William didn't think that this experience in Parliament was that big of a deal. He didn't resign his position, and he stayed as governor of New England. And Benjamin felt betrayed. Not only that, but William actually decided to stay loyal to the crown during the war, and his father never forgave him for it. For all intents and purposes, their relationship was over. Ben Franklin was quoted as saying, "Nothing has ever hurt me so much and affected me with such a keen sensation as to find myself deserted in my old age by my only son. And not only deserted, but to find him taking up arms against me in a cause wherein my good fame, fortune, and life were all at stake." Ben never forgave him. When he was in prison during the war, Ben let him sit there. Then, Benjamin Franklin made sure to write William out of his will and said, quote, "The part he acted against me in the late war, which is of public notoriety, will account for my leaving him no more an estate than he endeavored to deprive me of." Now let's take a moment and transition from what I always thought was such a fascinating story of Benjamin Franklin and refocus our attention on the colonial reactions to the coercive acts. Now, to set the stage, remember, at this point in 1774, most colonists wanted to remain part of the empire. They wanted to be Britons, they wanted to be Britons in colonies in America. But word was spreading throughout the colonies of the rise of a tyrant, that being King George III, or Parliament, and the treatment of the colonists in Boston was becoming more widespread and understood. Of course, while many in the colonies were still considering some type of diplomatic compromise, the rebels in Boston were doing anything but that. General Gage had tried to move the governing capital to Salem in order to get away from the rebels in the city, but he soon found out that that was not going to work either. Much to the surprise of General Gage and other British officials, many in the countryside in Massachusetts began to fall in line to support the rebellion. As those in the countryside became more poor and struggled with rough soil, they began to fear that the British-dominated government would potentially slowly erode their land holdings and force them into some type of quasi-serfdom, like Britain had done in its colony of Scotland. These countryside colonists began to gather together and force officials of local government and councils out of their roles, leveling significant social and political threats against them. General Gage said, quote, "The disease was believed to be confined to the town of Boston, but now it is so universal, there is no knowing where to apply a remedy." Sam Adams, speaking to Richard Henry Lee, said that the challenge is, quote, "whether the people of America would consider these measures, the coercive acts, as an attack on the constitution of an individual province in which the rest are not interested, or will they view the model of government prepared for us as a system for the whole continent?" And this was exactly the type of dilemma that many colonists were in. Those in Massachusetts, on May 13, 1774, sent out a circular letter, or I should have said specifically those in Boston sent out this letter. to the rest of Massachusetts and to the other colonies, because they wanted to convince them that, in fact, these actions were just a precursor for what Britain wanted to do in the rest of the colonies. And I want to read this, and I'll read it quickly, but I want to read this circular letter because this lays the groundwork for everything that's going to happen here in this revolutionary period leading up to the fighting. The letter said, "We have just received a copy of an act of British Parliament passed in the present session, whereby the town of Boston is treated in a manner the most ignominious, cruel, and unjust. The Parliament have taken upon them, from the representations of our governor and other persons inimical to and deeply prejudiced against the inhabitants, to try, condemn, and by an act to punish them, unheard, which would have been in violation of natural justice even if they had acknowledged jurisdiction. They have ordered our port to be entirely shut up, leaving us so barely so much of the means of subsistence as to keep us from perishing with cold and hunger. It is said that a fleet of British ships of war is to block up our harbor until we shall make a restitution to the East India Company for the loss of their tea, which was destroyed therein the winter past. Obedience is paid to the laws and authority of Great Britain, and the revenue is duly collected. The act fills the inhabitants with indignation. The more thinking part of those who have hitherto been in favor of the measures of British government look upon it as not to have been expected even from a barbarous state. This attack, though made immediately upon us, is doubtless designed for every other colony who will not surrender their sacred rights and liberties into the hands of an infamous ministry. Now, therefore, is the time when all should be united in opposition to this violation of liberties of all. Their grand object is to divide the colonies. We are well informed that another bill is to be brought into Parliament to distinguish this from the other colonies by repealing some of the acts which have been complained of and ease the American trade. But be assured, you will be called upon to surrender your rights if ever they should succeed in their attempts to suppress the spirit of liberty here in Massachusetts. The single question then is whether you consider Boston as now suffering in the common cause, and sensibly feel and resent the injury and affront offered to here. If you do, and we cannot believe otherwise, weigh we not from your approbation of our former conduct in defense of American liberty, rely on your suspending your trade with Great Britain, at least which it is acknowledged will be great but necessary sacrifice to the cause of liberty, and will effectually defeat the design of this act of revenge by Parliament. If this should be done, you will please to consider it will be, though a voluntary suffering, greatly short of what we are called to endure under the immediate hand of tyranny. We desire your answer by the bearer, and after assuring you that, not in the least intimidated by this inhumane treatment, we are still determined to maintain to the utmost of our abilities the rights of America. We are, gentlemen, your friends and fellow countrymen. As you can see, the colonists in Boston are saying, look at what is happening to us. They've basically reduced us to some type of political slavery, and if they do this to us, they are going to do it to you next. Those in Boston viewed their cause not just as a cause for Bostonians, but as a continental cause. This is the opening of Pandora's box, they're arguing. Much to the surprise of many in London, including General Gage, many colonies fell in line supporting Massachusetts. On March 19th in Farmington, Connecticut, colonists gathered and said that they were going to throw a parade and burn a copy of the coercive acts. So they did just that. And they celebrated and passed 5 resolves. Their resolves, in summary, maintained that while they were still behind King George, and they still sort of liked him, they were with their sister state, Massachusetts, and they believed Parliament was corrupt and evil. The Port Bill was, quote, unjust, illegal, and oppressive, and that we and every American are sharers in the insults in the town of Boston. Later, I can't even make this up, they called Parliament pimps and parasites, and said that they despise every attempt for Parliament to force the chains of slavery on them. The colonists in New York gathered the Committee of 51 and issued a proclamation supporting Boston and said that they lament their inability to relieve the anxiety of Boston, and they recognized that the only way to fix this problem would be for the colonies to unite and triumph the, quote, adversaries of our liberty. Then they recommended that a Congress of the Colonies gather, which is something that I will cover in our next episode in the lesson on the First Continental Congress. In Philadelphia in June, they said the Port Act was unconstitutional, and similar to New York, they said the colonists needed to be called together to discuss actions and determine the next steps that, of course, would be constitutional. Many other colonies gathered together in support of Boston. Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and the Carolinas all offered varying types of support for those in Boston. The Bostonians gathered back together on June 8th after hearing some of the reactions from their neighboring colonies. And the Boston Committee of Correspondence, headed by Samuel Adams, sent another circular letter demanding that all colonies suspend all commercial intercourse with Britain from August 31st until the Boston Port Act was repealed. This is a huge ask, and they recognized how serious this was and how big of a request this was, and they dubbed it a, quote, solemn league and covenant with the rest of the colonies. The request failed to garner widespread support, forcing Samuel Adams and the Boston Radicals to defer to issues of non-importation, and they will then have that conversation when they meet at the Continental Congress. Back in Boston, though, things were just continuing to get worse. On September 1st, 1774, General Gage sent a group of about 250 men to Charlestown and Cambridge to seize gunpowder and munitions. Sound familiar? It was a fairly innocent endeavor, and it was nicknamed the Powder Alarm. But rumors began to spread that the soldiers wantonly murdered colonists, and that some ships from the Royal Navy were firing on Boston. This, unsurprisingly, caused colonists from all over the New England area to take up arms and begin to show active support for the colonists in Massachusetts. Now, of course, this didn't happen. It was a false alarm, but it was impactful nonetheless. General Gage, who had temporarily moved the government to Salem, like I mentioned earlier, decided to head back to Boston, where he could at least have his troops around him to protect him. The rapid mobilization of the militia was short-lived, but basically laid the blueprint for future events, of the shots heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. Keep in mind, at this point, the city of Boston had not been filled in yet and was a peninsula with just a tiny piece of land connecting it to the mainland, Boston Neck. So when General Gage basically put troops on Boston Neck, it looked like he was mobilizing his military for action. A supporter of the British government in the colonies said, quote, I really fear should the general send his troops out of Boston again, he should lose them. How to resist such an enraged multitude is not for me to say or even pretend to guess. Of course, Gage was worried that the colonists would escalate the situation, so when he began preparing his military defenses in Boston, this just infuriated the colonists even more. On September 9, 1774, colonists met in Suffolk County and created the Suffolk Resolves, in which they declared the coercive acts to be unconstitutional and null and void. The next month, in October, they created the Provincial Congress and said that the British officials in the area held no power and their governance was illegitimate. Many of the patriots recognized the king as honorable and legitimate, therefore they were willing to concede a bit on royal governors. But it was Parliament that was truly frustrating them. They refused to allow another legislature to overrule their local legislatures. And per the recommendation of other surrounding colonies, those in Massachusetts decided to join their fellow colonists at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. As you pack up your things, there's one specific response to the coercive acts that I have left out so far, and it is that of a young Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a summary view of the rights of British America in August of 1774. And I want to read from you some of the powerful language from this response. Jefferson says, and I'll just read the quotes one by one. "It behooves you, therefore, to think and act for yourself and your people. The great principles of right and wrong are legible to every reader. To pursue them requires not the aid of many counselors. The whole art of government consists in the art of being honest. Only aim to do your duty, and mankind will give you credit where you fail. These are our grievances, which we have thus laid before His Majesty, with that freedom of language and sentiment which becomes a free people, claiming their rights as derived from the law of nature, and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy, but cannot disjoin them. And lastly, our properties within our own territories should not be taxed or regulated by any power on earth but our own." The eloquent writing and incredible arguments included in this very lengthy summary view of the rights of British America vaulted Thomas Jefferson into celebrity status in the colonies, and he will continue to hold this influence as we talk about next episode with the meeting of the First Continental Congress and the gathering of colonial fervor toward revolution. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. Please don't forget to go to the website www.ateachershistory.com to register to potentially be a guest host on our rebranding episode 50, or for a chance to win a presidential bobblehead. Of course, you can find me on Twitter at @ATeachersHist, on Facebook @Teachers History Podcast, and if you haven't yet, please take the time to leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would mean a ton. All right, see you next episode.